Good morning, everybody. Welcome. You know how it goes. We're a couple minutes out, but we wanted to open up the room so everybody could come in and get settled. So please do just that. We will start promptly at the top of the hour. Welcome again. We're opening up a couple minutes early. Come on in and get settled. We'll get started at the designated time. Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Again, we'll get started at the designated time. Feel free to come in and get settled digitally, as it were. All right, we'll give it just a couple seconds more. We just hit the top of the hour, but if your life is like our life, you're probably coming from different places. So one meeting to the next. So we'll give it just a couple seconds more and let the numbers start leveling off. And just from a housekeeping standpoint, Alina, are we good on recording? Have you started, or that just started automatically? So we should be good. All right, just a second or two more. All right, I think we're probably at a pretty good starting time. Welcome, my name is Gene Kerns. I have the honor of serving as the Chief Academic Officer at Renaissance, and I am joined today by my colleagues, Dr. Carol Johnson, who's gonna, I'll tell you what Carol's gonna do in just a minute, Dr. Jan Bryan, who's helping out in the background and take care of all of your chat and resource needs, and our colleague Alina, and we're gonna make sure that you have a great time this morning as we talk about practical, and that's a purposeful choice there, practical tools for differentiating. And the particular space we're going to talk about is the subject area of literacy, and the particular kids we're going to focus in on are those kids in late elementary up through the secondary level. With that framed, let's get ready to dive in. We use the word differentiation in the title there, but here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about what is the difference between differentiation, individualization, personalization, because there's a lot of nuances there. There's not even complete agreement in the press, and we could eat up 2 hours of valuable time and probably not make a difference for kids. Just make a definition clearer in our mind. So don't worry too much about whether we're saying differentiation or personalization or whatever the term is. What we are talking about today is trying to help teachers not do this. Now, I love these historical pictures of school, and we all have heard that assertion that schools were based on a factory model. And there's truth there, because at the same time that mass public schooling was going online in the United States, the Industrial Revolution was transforming the world. So it makes perfect sense that the people of that time would have looked and borrowed ideas from factories to bring into the schools that they were ramping up. And even though people have said factory model, as if we treat kids as commodities that get run through a process, I think that's an overly pessimistic view. In my mind, I truly do believe that the factory model never existed. Because you see, I think teachers have always sought to respond to the needs that their kids have. And machines and factories don't respond to unique variances in their raw materials. They just reject the material or go on from there. The teachers have always sought to respond to kids' needs. And that's all we're talking about today is how do you respond to the differences, the variations, the needs that kids have when they come into your classroom? Because we are not running factories, we are running schools. We are not producing things out of raw materials. We are helping young human beings mature and grow. And that's just fundamentally different. And so today, when we talk about differentiation, that's just as long and short and as simple as the definition is. How do you respond to the individual needs that kids have so that things are optimized for them? And of course, the conversation is going on and on and on about what's changing. Well, technology is changing. So in a world where we're now talking about ChatGPT and other, I didn't say that right, GPT, and other technologies with artificial intelligence coming in and being able to write papers, we've got to be able to marshal all of this fabulous technology that is at our hands and at our fingertips to do more in responding to the needs that kids have. And in that sense, I think conversations about differentiation are part and parcel with the stated mission that Renaissance has, which is to accelerate learning for all. Because you see, when teachers are better able to respond to the unique needs that their students have, of course, learning will be accelerated, and the opposite is also completely true. When teachers are limited in what they're able to do in responding, then learning will not be completely accelerated. Because, as I said before, I think teachers have always sought to respond to kids' need. The problem is, the time marched on, the factory marched on to some degree, so teachers could do some things, but they can only go so far. So today's conversation is, how do we do more? How can we go further? How can we respond to the unique qualities that kids have when they enter our classroom? So before I dive into one of the nuances, I'm going to kind of launch the first poll, which will help us here a little bit. And my question is simply this: when someone says to you, older students, who comes to mind? And you can check multiple ones here. When you see an event or you see a description, you see a book that starts talking about older students, who really springs to mind? A couple seconds here for folks to vote. We're kind of seeing the answer that I expected, but I haven't asked this poll before, so I don't know what I quite expected here. We think that an idea is there. So a couple seconds more as folks are responding. Let me end and share this with you. Most folks pretty unanimously, in fact, 100% of people said, I think 9 to 12 when you say older. 88 or 86% of the audience said, I think 6 to 8. And there were some people that said 4 to 5. Now, I will admit, my background is secondary. So when you say to me, older kids, I don't think off of the top of my head, right out of the gate, about any kids in elementary school, because to me, that doesn't seem really, really older, but I probably should. Because when it comes to literacy, in most instances, it makes sense to loop or lump 4th and 5th graders with their secondary counterparts. Because what 4th and 5th graders are doing in terms of literacy looks much more like what 6th and 7th graders are doing than it does like 1st and 2nd graders. Kids in elementary school are going through such amazing changes in terms of what they can do around literacy. So we are talking today about late elementary school all the way up through secondary. Actually, some of the ideas we're going to talk about don't just apply to kids, they apply to how we as adults continue to build our literacy capacity. Because you see, I personally believe that literacy is made up of 2 landscapes. That journey to literacy is 2 landscapes that everybody must traverse. One is the landscape that you must cover before you've learned the mechanics of reading. There's phonemic awareness and phonics. There's where you can't match the letters and the sounds, and you're learning how to do that. Or you may not even be phonetically aware. You may not even realize or hear that words are made up with sounds. That is one landscape that you have to make your way through. And we talked about that one on an earlier webinar. So if you're looking for more on that space, we can get you the link for that one. But today's topic, what we really want to explore now, is that second landscape. The landscape of what do you need to do for kids after they have learned the mechanics of reading. And for most intents and purposes, the lessons around phonemic awareness and phonics and decoding and those types of things are all front-loaded, even though they still appear in the standards to some degree in some of the later grades. Most of the stuff is covered in K1, 2, and 3, a little bit in 4 and 5. And by then, you can't find a state in the country that references foundational skills in any grade beyond 5. If we think about it this way and make a connection to the growing conversation around the science of reading, what we're saying is it starts here. There's the word recognition, the phonological awareness, the decoding those lessons there. But at a certain point, that is done. There's only 44 phonemes in the English language, and we're not making any new ones. So once you learn them, you've got them, okay? However, background knowledge and vocabulary. These are going to be 2 big themes for us today, because you see, throughout our entire lives, We are all actually building more vocabulary and more background knowledge. And it is vocabulary and background knowledge that are key drivers for literacy growth after you have learned the mechanics of reading. You see those first grades, those early foundational skills, the phonemic awareness, the phonics, okay? That's the foundation. But I also like to say, you don't live in a foundation. You live in a house. You got to build something on top of it to have the entire structure there. Don't hear me saying anything bad or wrong about early foundational skills. They need to be there in the same way that when I built a house, I wanted the foundation to be as good as it possibly could be, okay? So the foundational skills are there, and that's why we called them the foundational skills. But today we're talking about what gets built on top of them. How do we build that complete structure of literacy that takes kids to the highest levels? So for better understanding, I think it would be good. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to review a little bit of research, and then I'm going to show you a few products that we have from Renaissance. Make sure you are up to date on the latest and greatest. And then I said Carol's on the line, and Carol's going to take a unique role. Carol is taking the role of someone serving emerging bilingual kids. So emerging bilinguals, English language learners, whatever the term is in your area there, she's going to say to us, but here's exactly what you need to think about for those kids. So I'm going to go right down the center of the road and just say, what does comprehension look like, assuming that I'm talking about it from a native English speaker standpoint, okay? I think reading comprehension, which of course is our ultimate goal. I think it's made up of three things. In fact, my colleagues, Robin Fogarty and Brian Pete and I wrote about this in our book, Literacy Reframed. We called it the big three. And so you get how many parts there are. There are three. Part number one is decoding. There's those early grades, foundational skills. You must be able to associate letters and sounds. So if you will, sound this word out. Now, I can't hear you on the screen there, so I'll go in honesty that you're probably, my guess is you don't know how to sound this out, okay? Because you don't know the phonology of this particular language. You cannot associate those symbols with any sounds, okay? In fact, you just stop dead in tracks on the first line there. Let me tell you what this word is. It is the Russian word for blanket. Now, we chose this word blanket purposely because we were trying to think of what is a word that a young child would know. I mean, about the time we're 3 or 4 years old, a lot of us understand what a blanket is, okay? That doesn't mean that even though we know the sound of the word and we know the meaning of the word, that doesn't mean that we have any ability to associate these squiggles with that sound and that meaning. That's what we're learning when we learn to decode, how to associate the symbols of our languages with their sounds and their meaning. So of course, to be literate, the first part is you must be able to decode, okay? You've got to be able to associate letters and sounds, but that's not where it stops. The next thing is you need vocabulary, okay? When you sound out a word that you think is unknown to you in text, you've seen lots of young kids do this. They start sounding out a word that they think they don't know. And then they sound it out. And in the process of making their way through the decoding, you just see this light bulb go off where they say, oh, I know that word. They just didn't recognize it in print yet. So we teach kids to sound out the letters and the sounds. And if they sound it out and they know their word, they are fast track towards decoding. Excuse me, fast track towards comprehension. But I do want to point out the limitations of vocabulary. And I have a question for you. And that is, how much unknown stuff? Another way of saying that is, how many unknown words? What percentage of unknown words can we as readers tolerate before it becomes overloading, before it is too frustrating and we shut down? And another element that happens is comprehension is severely limited. So I want to hear from you on that one. So let's get our second poll going here. And my question is, what percentage of unknown words can a reader tolerate in a text before comprehension is compromised? Do you think it's less than 5%? Do you think it's 5 to 10%, 11 to 15%, or 16 to 20? Let's hear what you think. And then I'll tell you what research reveals in the space. And this is an important one because every state out there says, for example, this standard's everywhere. Students will figure out the meaning of unknown vocabulary words by using context clues. Well, how much context do you have to have? How many other words do you have to know around the unknown word before you have a chance of figuring it out, okay? A couple seconds more and I'll show you the results. And I'll hint at you a little bit here. Some of you all remember the old game show that's still on, Price is Right. Beep, 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 you've all overbid. For the first beginning of this, a lot of you had overbid. A lot of you had said, we can tolerate more unknown words. Here's what you all are saying. Most of you are saying, we think you can tolerate 5 to 10%. Some people think you can tolerate more than that, 11 to 15%. And a tiny portion of you, about a third, said, I think it's less than 5%. Well, it's critical that we know this because it turns out vocabulary can be a big tripping stone for kids. According to Daniel Willingham, the famed cognitive scientist, we have very low tolerance for unknown words. He estimates it at about 2%. Now, there's some different authors out there, so it can be plus or minus just a little bit. I have never, however, seen any author assert that we can tolerate more than 5% unknown words. So we've got to know 95% of the words in the text to understand what's going on. We've got to know 95% of the words before we have any chance of figuring out at a basic level the meaning of the unknown stuff. If you don't believe that, here's an example that Carol came up with. So Carol did this years ago. I mean, it's just priceless. Here's a passage where you can read well 95% of the words. Take a second and try to read that and see if you'd be cool with having some comprehension questions at the end. My guess is probably not, because even with only 5% of the words obscured to you in this case, I'm sure that you read this and you say, I'm getting some of these ideas, but I'm not getting all of this, okay? So we have to be able to decode words, and then we need to know a lot of words, because if we decode a word and we don't know the meaning, we are no closer to comprehension than we would have been otherwise. So decoding is so important. Vocabulary is so important. And we want kids to know words, but here's another insight we need to have. Cervetti, Wright, Wang, they said, you can't teach enough words. Now, I'm not saying don't teach vocabulary. Do teach vocabulary directly. There are smart ways to do it. I'll give you a book reference in just a minute here, but you need to realize that just directly teaching vocabulary is not enough. By the way, most of the words that highly literate people know, they didn't really learn by anybody teaching to them directly. We learn them through listening and through reading. Being read to and reading, and that's a theme we're going to see again and again and again today. The benefits of wide independent reading when you are capable of doing it. Daniel Willingham echoes almost exactly what Cervetti, Wright, and Wang say when he says, most of the vocabulary you know is not the product of someone's direct instruction to you. You learn most of the words you know through reading and through conversations. And as a result of that dynamic, Willingham says that the best advice he would ever offer to kids is not just to read, but to read a lot. And that's going to be a common theme. Now, again, I'm not saying don't teach vocabulary. In fact, I am saying do, but do so smartly. And if you're looking for directions on the very best ways to get the most generative power in teaching vocabulary, then this book here, Bringing Words to Life, Beck, McCowan, and Kuchen, that's one of the best ones out there, okay? But realize that even if you implement every idea that they're talking about, kids are going to still need more words. And that brings us to the third part of the big three. We need the ability to decode fluently. We need to have lots of vocabulary words that we can associate with sound and meaning to the words that we decode in text. And then in addition to that, sometimes to fully comprehend what's going on, we need some background knowledge. I want to share a couple of examples with you. Sue Pimental, who works with Student Achievement Partners, she says the research that we're about to look at, she says, is some of the most profoundly important and yet under-recognized literacy research that there is, and that this research has huge implications for what we do in terms of instructing kids around literacy. To prove to you that vocabulary doesn't get you all of the way, I have a list of words for you. Now, remember, you can tolerate a little bit of unknown vocabulary. So in chat, what I would like you to do is enter one word that you think might trip you up if I gave you a passage to read using these words, okay? In other words, most of you are not going to say, I have a problem with the word mine. I don't know what that means. Or I have a problem with the word category. I don't know what that means. You can vote for one word on here. If I were to say to you, what one word on this list might you not have your hands around really tightly? Which one would you say? Also, kind of like, you remember Family Feud, where I surveyed 100 people and the top 5 answers are on the board. When I give this list to adults, aha, there it comes. That's the word that everybody always picks. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Rebecca. Everybody also always says manifold. Now, some people might say, I've heard manifold reasons. Maybe it means something about plural. Other people say, I know there's a part in a car called a manifold, but I don't really know what it does. So, okay, maybe manifold will trip you up. The whole point is this. If comprehension was only your ability to decode, which I know you all have, and if it was only decoding and vocabulary, then you would be able to successfully read this passage. Give it a try. Now, the example that Carol gave you earlier there with the 95%, she was a little bit kinder because that was a 3rd grade passage. Okay, it wasn't all that hard. This is college. So I'll admit this is challenging. It's a complex thing, but it's a real passage. It's a passage you might encounter if you took a philosophy class. The whole point is this. You can have every decoding skill that there is in the world. You can know vocabulary words, but if you don't have some of the knowledge in the background around what this author is writing about, even a simple question like, this is the main idea, that might be problematic for you, okay? Because you need to understand that this is philosophy, and this is Immanuel Kant, who is interested in the ways that people could be in a room and they could see the same experience and they could take away different things from it. Categories, the way that we organize our world, the views that we have, the way that we take in information. The more knowledge I give you about Immanuel Kant, the closer you would get to understanding that C was the correct answer here. But without that background knowledge, you're not going to get an answer to the question. E.D. Hirsch, who created this example, says, if we did to adults with that question what we do to kids, we would simply say, well, let me give you some extra time, or let me have you summarize or classify or find the main idea. The reality of it is that you have to have some background knowledge to understand what the author is talking about. Let me share one last study, and then we're going to transition into some products that we want to share with you, some solutions that you can use. Many of them are free or available to you right now, but let me get one more piece of research. This is a study that explored the power of knowledge in reading comprehension. It's one of many, okay? I chose this one because it's one of the more modern ones and because of something beautifully written in its summary. Kiefer, Newman, and Pinkman, okay? They were trying to show how closely reading ability is linked to socioeconomic status and knowledge. So they gave a passage on birds to a mixed group of kids. And when they tested the reading comprehension levels of that mixed group of kids on a passage on birds, what they found was, in general, the higher socioeconomic status kids demonstrated a higher level of comprehension, and the lower socioeconomic kids demonstrated a lower. We see this all the time. Okay, we talk about this divide, but here's what Kiefer, Newman, and Pinkman wanted to know. Do the more well-off kids, are they demonstrating a higher level of reading comprehension because they're actually better readers, or because they were more advantaged? Because you see, Kiefer, Newman, and Pinkman believed that they weren't necessarily better readers of the mechanics of the text around birds, but these kids, because of their advantages, had probably seen more birds, had access to more books, maybe had a pet bird, had been taken to zoos or natural history museums where they saw live birds or taxidermy birds, traveled and seen it. They had so many advantages that gave them so much more information about birds, which allowed them to read a passage on birds better. So here's what they decided to do. Kiefer, Newman, and Pinkman wanted to know what would happen if you gave a group of kids a passage on something that nobody had any additional background knowledge than anybody else. Now, they thought about using rare animals like an okapi, but they actually, in the end, decided that the only way that they could guarantee that no kid about to read that passage had ever possibly seen anything or had any experience as animal was to create a fictitious animal. Now, they didn't tell the kids this was a made-up animal. They gave them a passage, a written passage that looked like any other real passage, and it was on a fictitious animal called a wug. And it was the same kind of thing we give kids in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade. This is a WUG, this is where they live, this is the animals they're related to, this is their habitat, this is their behavior, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then there were some comprehension questions at the end. And here's where the study got amazing. Because remember, these same kids, when you tested them on birds, the higher SES kids did better and the low SES kids did worse. But when they read about WUGs and then their comprehension level was tested, everybody had a fairly uniform level of comprehension. The higher SES kids didn't read this any better, and the lower SES kids, their comprehension wasn't any lower, which prompted Kiefer, Newman, and Pink. And remember, I said there are beautiful words in their summary. These are powerful words. Here's what they said. In other words, the gap in comprehension that we often see between high SES and low SES kids, in this case, that gap was not a gap in skills. It was a gap in knowledge. Now, when I talk about knowledge, I'm talking about names and dates and places that come from every subject area. If somebody says to you, that was a Trojan horse, I hope you learned some mythology somewhere. If someone says, what's the half-life of that, or what was your litmus test, you needed to have picked those things up in science class. And if someone says that was her Waterloo moment, you would have gotten that one from history. Because you see, there are names and dates and places and references that come from all of the content areas and all of the arts. And understanding those names and dates and places and references, those two are part of being highly literate. That is why, again, a theme that we're going to see again and again and again. Remember what I said, we learn more vocabulary by reading. We learn more knowledge by reading. We learn so much through reading, and that is why Mike Schmoker said in his book, Focus, once you've taught a kid to decode, once they've made it through that landscape of the mechanics of reading, then what he said, one of the most important things for us to do is to organize time in language arts and in all the other subject areas so that students spend large amounts of time reading, both purposely for our academic endeavors and for pleasure, because it is through reading that so much goes on. So that said, that's some of the research you wanted to use. Let's make some connections to some resources from Renaissance that might help you in this space. The first thing I want to make sure that everybody's aware of is our myON digital reading platform. Now, for those of you that don't know myON, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what it is. And for those of you that do know myON, Carol's going to show you something about myON that you might not realize that you can do. Okay, so what is myON? It is unlimited access to thousands of enhanced digital books. What do we mean enhanced? We mean it's not just the digital book saying that this is not Kindle for kids, okay? It's more than that. myON allows for personal recommendations. Kids can do an interest inventory and it will recommend books to them. Books that are written at the appropriate level in terms of their readability and that are appropriate in terms of content. So myON constantly, as kids logging in, is recommending new books to them that are appropriate and on topics that they are interested in. And then the texts themselves have things like audio narration. That's huge. Carol's going to come back to that one. 98% of the books in the myON collection, which numbers, 10,000 plus, 98% of the books in there have an audiobook component where real actors read the book aloud to kids. They can highlight, they can access a dictionary, they can get all kinds of other supports. Teachers can cluster books together and create assignments and embed writing prompts. There's all types of things. So again, this is not Kindle for kids. And it's online and offline. So if your kids go home and they don't have internet, they can download the books and take them. And it's also not a program like Overdrive, a library system that gives you simply a digital copy of a book that you have. If you wanted every kid in your building to read the same book at the same time, that could happen through here. And again, reading and writing collections. And another thing about the collection itself is roughly 70% nonfiction. Here's why that's important. Remember, we said knowledge makes you more literate, and you're going to get more knowledge by reading actually informational texts. So here's an analysis that we did. Based on accelerated reader quizzes and myON activities, we know that when kids are not on myON, they tend to read about one book out of every 4 as nonfiction. So roughly about 25% nonfiction that they read. But when they have myON, meaning that a massive collection of informational text is available to them literally at their fingertips, the amount of reading of nonfiction that they do essentially doubles, plus or minus just a little bit. You see anywhere from 43 to 54%. What that tells us is kids will read more nonfiction when they can get to it easily. And when you think about it, when I taught school, most of my classroom library was fiction, not nonfiction. And so this access to thousands of fiction pieces really, really important because it brings the information that helps you out with the third part of the big three. So let's talk about just helping kids read more, giving easy access to books. We have seen the same thing for the last 20 years in our data. That is, the kids that read 15 minutes or less each day tend to be falling further and further behind. So you see that line there at 0. Normal curve equivalent simply means, are they maintaining their place in terms of performance? Anything that's positive, they're moving up. Anything that's negative is moving down. Kids who read less than 15 minutes a day are constantly, slowly losing ground. While at the same time, kids who we can support in reading 15 minutes or more daily are constantly moving further and further ahead, okay? It is a critical tipping point, somewhere right around 15 minutes. So keep that in mind. If your kids are not reading supplementally, additionally, beyond what we do, 15 minutes or more a day, they are falling behind. And sadly, our data set also suggests that slightly more than half of kids, 54%, do not read 15 minutes or more each day. So what that means is a massive percentage of our student population is simply not reading enough to keep up. And when you think about the big three, it explains why. When you don't read, you don't build vocabulary. When you don't read, you don't build knowledge. There's a direct relationship between reading and critical thinking. When you don't read, you are not exercising your primary academic muscle that's up there. And so we need easy access to books. Now, in an attempt to incentivize kids to read or simply create more reading in schools, a lot of schools have turned to programs like SSR, Silent Sustained Reading, or DEAR, Drop Everything and Read. And according to an analysis done by Dr. Keith Topping at the University of Dundee in Scotland, roughly half of those programs seem to show, or half of the studies about these programs seem to show some positive effects, but about half show no effect. It's about mixed. 6 showing some positive effects, 5 showing really no effect at all. Now, Topping was analyzing SSR in DEAR in contrast with more structured programs like Accelerated Reader and like myON. And what he said, in the case of Accelerated Reader, where 2 things are happening. One, there is a consideration of the book level being placed into kids' hands to give them a just right level, something that's not too challenging and not too easy. And on the back end, there's a flow of information, comprehension tests that let you know how well your kids are comprehending. So if they are not well comprehending what they read, you can step in and intervene. These 2 elements are powerful, and notice the impacts. At the time that Topping did that analysis in 2000, what he found was there were 12 studies on an Accelerated Reader programs, and 11 of the 12 cited positive benefits. So Accelerated Reader, with 220,000 plus and constantly growing comprehension quizzes for you to access to simply give you a read on how kids are doing. And even though that sounds simple, the impact of that is powerful. Now, Topping has been writing extensively about this because he says, in terms of supporting independent reading, that is where we've done the most with software in our entire world. He just published a 2023 book. You see it here. He is a prolific author in this field, and he has been studying Accelerated Reader and reading counts and similar programs for nearly 3 decades now. And what he said is the research is absolutely clear. Accelerated Reader is one of the most researched programs in the field, with even randomized and controlled group studies demonstrating its efficacy. It's been reviewed by highly respected groups such as the National Center for Response to Intervention, the Dropout Prevention Network, and the Promising Practices Networks. And in this book that just came out this year, he also mentioned that myON, as a new piece, also, even though it's a much younger product already has 4 significant studies, all of which note the positive effects that it can have on kids. So Accelerator Reader in myON is a way to incentivize students to read widely. Also, kids need to practice skills, and I want to make sure that you are aware of our Freckle product. And you may have heard about Freckle before, but I want to make sure you understand how Freckle is evolving, okay? Freckle is a practice program. All 4 content areas are in there: math, English language arts, science, and social studies. It is math and English language arts that have the most content. It's widely used. You see the numbers here: 700,000 teachers working with 10 million kids across 75,000 schools. But here's what you need to know. Renaissance bought Freckle several years ago. It had the most math content. We finished out the math content through high school, but our number 1 priority with Freckle right now is adding additional English language arts content. So over the last year, the amount of English language arts content in that program has gone up radically, and that will continue to happen for at least another year to 18 months or maybe 2 years. So we are constantly adding to Freckle. Now, even though you see JT the Pig, he's the icon for the program, older kids are not going to see JT the Pig. So it's got different interfaces for kids that matures as they mature. And it does begin with really simple things like sight words and decodables for younger kids. But for older kids all the way through high school, Freckle then transforms into a series of articles on a wide variety of nonfiction topics and skills practice with specific English language arts skills like making connections and interpreting inferences there. So Freckle can begin with them when they're young and can carry them all the way through. And by the way, there's a free version of Freckle. So if you want to try it out right now, because you see, often differentiating means you need to create another group in your room, which means that you need to be working with some kids while other kids are doing something else. Freckle is a great something else for kids to be doing. And again, there's a free version that you can try it. It simply limits how many assignments you can have out to your kids. And this time of the year, this point of the year that we are in right now, is a great time to try out new things. Here's why. Number 1, you and the kids are all bored. You know, we're in March, they get the routine, they've been doing the normal stuff. You bring something in new right now, interest will go up because it's something new and it's because it's something different. Here's the other advantage that this time of the year has for you. If you piloted it now, you're going to make mistakes. We all do when we pilot something new. But if you pilot it now and you make a few mistakes in March and April and May, and then you decide, I like that, I like to use that next year. Well, when you come back in next year, you're ready to start a whole year having learned from your mistakes of the spring. So it's a good time to try out new things right now. I would mention that Freckle has 2 ways that kids can practice. One is adaptive, which means it branches and it responds to their correct answers and takes them on pathways that they can kind of direct, but it also has targeted practice, where a teacher can say, the next time a kid logs on, this is the skill that I want them to do. And both of those things can be happening simultaneously. So it can be giving kids adaptive practice that the kids are kind of driving on their own. But then you as a teacher can also say, I want this to be the next activity. So both can be going on at the same time. That brings us to a poll. I've got just 1 or 2 more things to show you, and then Carol's going to talk with us about our English language learners who have some specific needs in terms of literacy. But before I show you the last really powerful thing that we have that's now available, I want to ask you this question, or actually it's multi-parts here. So do you use STAR assessments from Renaissance in your district, yes or no? Or perhaps you use FastBridge assessments, also part of the Renaissance family, yes or no? And are you familiar with the instructional platform called Nearpod? Yes or no? So just a couple seconds there for folks to respond. And here's what a lot of people might know. First of all, you picked up on it. A lot of people might not know that FastBridge is now part of the Renaissance family. And a lot of people might not know that Nearpod is also part of the Renaissance family. So what we're doing is making these tools work together. Let me stop the poll for just a second and share the results so that we can see what's going on. We've got a lot of STAR users. We've got some FastBridge users in the room as well. That is awesome. And roughly a little bit more of you are familiar with Nearpod than not, but there's 40% of the audience that does not know what Nearpod is? Well, I'm about to show you something amazing. I want to show you something that is live in STAR right now that connects STAR to Nearpod, and it is coming soon to FastBridge. So FastBridge users, what I'm going to show you is not there yet, but it will be there soon. And when I say soon, I mean months, not years. So this is super cool stuff. I'm talking about the STAR to Nearpod connection. But to understand what it is, let me first show you what Nearpod is. So I'm simply going to go to the website nearpod.com. And by the way, this is a free tool. Again, it just limits how many assignments you can have out. So you can sign up for Nearpod right now. So I'm going to log in as a teacher, and you can get a chance to see what Nearpod is. It is a collection of lesson plans and teaching tools organized in a library. So I say Nearpod library. I can browse by current events. I can see a lot of things going on. Black History Month was just there. We're transitioning out of that. So there were Black History Month. There are things about holidays that are coming up. It's all very, very, very topical there. But I can browse by grade and subject, and I can be given all kinds of lessons that I can preview. And if I like them, I click Add to Lessons. They will then be posted in my lessons section. So here's a lesson I found on long A and short A. Notice what happens when I hover over that lesson. It gives me two options: live participation, which means I can put it up and we can all do it together, or student paced. I can make this an assignment where kids log on their own and make their way through it. Well, let me show you how this connects to STAR and how it will soon connect to Nearpod. Now, I should have told you earlier, today we're not training. I just want to make you aware that this connection exists. So I'm going to go quickly, but at the end, you can indicate how you might want to get some follow-up here. Log into STAR, go to record book. Doesn't matter which STAR test you're in, it's the same process. What you're looking for is this button that says Plan Instruction with Nearpod. Now, I didn't have any students in here because it's a demo site. You would have actually seen your students back there. There's 4 ways you can plan. If you have groups set up in here, you can plan for a group. If you want to click on an individual kid, you can plan for that kid. You can browse skills, click the grade, click the domain, or you can search for particular terms. So I don't know what to search for, so I'll just browse. Let me just say I'm browsing. I'm teaching a 3rd grade English language arts class. I'm looking for some lessons that I can do. I start scrolling down through in here. Oh, look, we were just working with prefixes and suffixes, okay? Here's a Nearpod lesson that aligns with that topic. I click on the lesson. It prompts me to let me know it's going to open a new window in something called Nearpod. You can stop seeing this message when you're comfortable with that. But it opens that very lesson, that 3rd grade lesson that you chose right there or was within range of your kids. Here it is. I can preview it. Again, if I like it, I click Add to My Lessons. And then once I've added it to my lessons in Nearpod, I can go back to my lesson section and assign that as either a live paced or a student paced lesson. And again, we'll give you more information about how to do this, but we wanted you to know that that connection exists because it is so powerful there. Also, too, other Renaissance products now have content in Nearpod. So there are myON lessons in there. There are Lalilo lessons in there. There are Freckle lessons in there. And again, this connection to go directly from an assessment result to a lesson plan is coming soon for Nearpod. Last thing is this. What if you're teaching older kids and the foundation is not strong? What if you are picking up on the fact that some of your older kids don't seem to maybe have some of those phonics skills in place? Now, I won't have time to go into detail about this, and this is kind of an exception, but I also want you to know that we have a tool called Star Phonics. Again, you can use it free for 90 days. It's a great time to try it this time of right year. So if you've got 4th graders, 5th graders, 6th graders, or even older kids that you think, I don't know that they have that foundation in place, follow the link there or go to renaissance.com, drill into Star Phonics. You can use this for 90 days. It's a really simple yet powerful tool that will survey your kids on phonics skills and let you know where the holes are on over 100 different phonics skills. So you screen the kids and it'll tell you exactly where the problem is. But we want to make sure that we have a specific conversation about our emerging bilinguals because they need unique support in this space. So Carol, help us know what we need to know about serving kids for whom this isn't just English.
Thank you, Jean, and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here today. Jean, you're going to move my slides, right? Okay, that's great. Thank you. So I am going to talk about emerging bilinguals, and I need to start by saying the truth is everything Jean just said is also true for emerging bilinguals. The difference is they come to us with a different dominant language other than English. And so what I'll talk about very briefly is how we consider working with our students using these tools, knowing that situation is just a tad different. But back to Scarborough's Rope. Yep, absolutely. It's exactly that's okay. Back to Scarborough's Rope, I'm going to talk about the issue of background knowledge and vocabulary with respect to emerging bilinguals. So now you can go there. And even though in the initial poll, and I agree with everyone, the response concerning who do we think of when we think of older students is not necessarily 4th and 5th graders. I wanted to go to this NAEP study, this recent NAEP report, just to give a perspective on emerging bilinguals and those older students beginning with the 4th grade. You can see on the slide that's on the screen that for 8th grade and 4th grade, it's from the 2022 report, but 12th grade is 2019, which says there was no data to be gained or gathered from 2019 to 2022 on these students. But here's what's important on this slide, and that is in this report, easily 2/3 to 3/4, depending on the grade level, of emerging bilinguals are not reading with basic comprehension in place. And I think it's important that we say that out loud because the challenge for them in terms of acquiring the vocabulary and the background knowledge is even more critical. It's more important that we face, and it's more important that we find an answer than our native speakers. And it's not that all kids don't matter, but it's even more an issue for emerging bilinguals. So now if we go to the next slide, Hirsch says this about everybody, and it's absolutely true. The achievement gap is a language gap and a knowledge gap. And that really is about as cleanly as we can say it for all students, but particularly for emerging bilinguals. So now if we go, knowing all of that, I think it comes down to what is the most important thing you can do realistically, practically, because in this, we're talking about the practicalities of making sure we meet the needs of our students. And for all of us, I believe that means that we have to be not just effective in what we do, but efficient, because we only have so many hours in the day. Okay, we can go again. So rather than be abstract, I thought I would talk about a 5th grade student and in the science area. So I thought it would be a good idea to move to the effect of literacy on achievement in the content areas. And I picked science. I picked 5th grade because that was just 1 year past the 4th grade I showed you on the slide from NAEP. And I wanted to talk about specifically the next generation science standards, because this is now the kind of content that our students are expected to achieve, to understand, to build, etc. So in your classroom, if you have a 5th grade student, imagine that you have a student who is an emerging bilingual who reads at a 1st grade 5th month to a 2nd grade 5th month level. So that's a student that's in the classroom that's exposed to a 5th grade textbook in science, but clearly does not read at that level. And you can see here the standard I chose was Earth Systems. So now if we'll go to the next one, I want to show you how you can use myON with sequential reading to support the student's development of both the vocabulary and the background knowledge necessary for succeeding with that textbook in your classroom. So here I've selected from myON 4 books that all talk about this same topic. And I've started on the left with the 1st grade 9th month book, and notice how I'm building to the right to higher level reading opportunities for this student. I have to start where she is, because that is what is comprehensible to her currently. But if we look inside these 4 books, I have a page from each one, you'll see what the student is getting and how the language and knowledge is building. So the first book, notice how simple the sentence is, straightforward, indicative, present tense sentence, but notice this is knowledge building and vocabulary building. And this is a level she can read right now. Now, if I go to the next book, notice I've moved up a grade level. There's more text on the screen. The sentences are a little bit more complex. And I chose this intentionally because you can see how it builds knowledge. So the sunlight zone is the top layer of the ocean. You can see it's really hard to read right here because of the auditory component that goes along with it. The slide I'm showing you is highlighting in bold text what's being read at that time. But if you can look at this slide in a little bit more detail, there's a word in there that's really important that I like in this slide, and it's the word munch. The reason I picked this is not simply because it's building knowledge, but that access to that word munch, very low frequency word in English, will never appear in a textbook. And yet it's a word all native speakers know by this age. And if our English emerging bilinguals are not given exposure to this low frequency vocabulary as they are building knowledge, they will still struggle to comprehend what they're reading. So we'll go to the next slide. This one, notice it's a little bit more academic in nature. You can see that it's talking about backbones, but once again, it's talking about the relationship between the species in an ecosystem, and that relates, of course, to the standard that we're talking about. And this helps build the knowledge, plus bring in that real academic vocabulary, like invertebrates. Okay, and then backbone, of course, the everyday word for it. Okay, one more. And this one is kind of a culmination. By the time this is at this fourth grade book, you can see that this is putting the big picture together in terms of all of the knowledge the student is starting to need concerning understanding the ecosystem. And in this case, we're talking the Earth's oceans. So if we go to one more slide, there's one more piece of research I think is really important to share with you. And for those of you who have emerging bilinguals who are dominant Spanish speakers, particularly, the research says this: their reading comprehension in the first language in elementary school, early grades, was a significant predictor for second language reading comprehension later, even in the 10th grade. So notice that we're talking about the relationship between those early grades and now really the older students we're talking about. And so if we go to one more slide, what I have for you is a book from myON, because myON also has books in Spanish that would also help the students support the knowledge that is being developed at this time to help understand and in the English-speaking classroom where the language of instruction is English. So I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, and I thank you for this time.
So, key idea being, we tend to think often of reading levels being fixed. And here's what Edie Hirsch says. I think it's so important. He says, a student can be a fabulous reader about dinosaurs and a terrible reader about mushrooms all at the same time. And you see when Carol put, I think what she said was so important is the sequential reading, getting those books in order. Read the first book, build some knowledge. The knowledge that you build in that first book that you could access allows you to then more successfully read the second book that's a little bit harder. So you're just slowly putting on a little bit more weight as you build students up in their knowledge so that they can get to the comprehension, a higher level text. Because remember, reading comprehension is not just vocabulary or decoding, it's also knowledge. So we can sequentially position text through independent reading or through the reading in myON to build students up and get them to dealing with grade level content. But that's only possible when you have access to thousands of books like myON, primarily with a nonfiction rich library collection like myON, and the ability to not be limited on how many times any individual book can be out. Again, I said you could use the same book with every kid in the whole school if that were appropriate for you at that time. So Carol's got her references in here. We'll include those as part of the slides towards the end if you want those, just so you can see where it all comes from. But I want to wrap up with this. We're going to wrap up with just one more idea, and then we'll get a little poll to see some follow-up you might want for you in here. Before I get there, I want to stress again today that our goal was not training. Our goal was awareness. So we've covered a lot of things really, really quickly. The star to nearpod connection, Freckle, star phonics, and myON, accelerated reader. Our goal was to cover the ground very quickly. The poll to the end is going to be the way that you can find out more in a slower, more focused way if you need. But I think that this citation sums up some of the most important ideas that we wanted to impart to you today. Question: how do we optimally achieve reading growth? Answer: coming from a variety of authors, all synthesized, by Mike Schmoker in his book Focus. After one has learned the mechanics of reading. So it's got to start there with those foundational skills. After one has learned the mechanics of reading, growth depends more than anything on doing what? Our ability to build up students' knowledge base and their vocabulary. This can only be achieved how? With the delivery of an organized, content-rich curriculum. There's the names and dates and places and references and ideas that come from all over that are matched with what? Abundant opportunities for students to read increasingly complex texts, both fiction and nonfiction. We've talked a lot about nonfiction. I don't want to belittle fiction. I have a degree in English, so I love that as well, but I've got to acknowledge the role of knowledge in comprehension. But we need abundant opportunities to read. And then Schmoker ends up with a very short sentence that just gets right to the point. There is no other way. If kids are not reading a lot, after they can mechanically read, if they're not reading a lot, there is no other way to get to a high level of literacy. And that is as simple and as complex as the answer can be. That brings us to our final poll for today, which is basically just a simple question for you of, is there something that we can help you out with? And it is not launching for me. Let me try that again. Alina, I will close and see if you can get that to launch. So we're gonna get that to pop up. And basically what it's gonna ask you is, do you need follow-up with anything? Do you wanna know more about star phonics? Do you wanna know more about Freckle? Do you wanna know more about that star to near pod connection? Or more about myON's use with emerging bilinguals? We'll see what's going on. The Zoom gods seem to not be very actively helping us today.
Yeah, it's not launching for some reason every time. I'm
Let me
sure
go back and try and make sure the other poll is stopped and see if that, oh, there we go. So here's the questions. Yes. Do you need some information on these? And there's a, I don't need anything down at the bottom. So if there's nothing you need from us, that is absolutely just fine. But if we brought up a topic that you said, you know, I'd like to know more about that. I need more details. Maybe that would work for us. Maybe that's something that we could use. And also too, let me emphasize something that I kind of said, but I want to make sure you understood that. The star to nearpod connection is live right now, and it costs you nothing, but you might not know how to use it. So maybe a small investment on a little bit of remote training, that might pay some great dividends. For those of you that have myON, many of you may not have thought about how to use it with emerging bilinguals. Maybe you'd like to get on the line with Carol and some of our other specialists and talk about what would that look like? How would we do that? You own the product, you've already paid for it. There's no cost there. You might just need a little bit of hand holding and a little bit of help to make that happen. Also too, we have in the list our What Kids Are Reading report is on the verge of releasing. So 2023, What Kids Are Reading is about to launch. We can make sure that you're a part of the first group that gets a copy of that so you can see the latest and greatest and the hottest books out there. But we'll leave that poll open and we'll get ready to wrap up with simple word of thank you for your time. We hope today that we did two things. We hope that we gave you an insight, that we presented a piece of information that allowed you to look at this topic of literacy in a different way with some new insights to it. And then we hope that we presented to you a practical idea. That's why we said practical in the title. It's got to be simple to do. And the question we would end with is, how can you move the needle? What is one small thing that you could bring in that would allow you to be differentiating just a little bit more in your classroom? Hopefully some of the options that we presented today seem viable to you. We'd love to stand by and help you with that. With that, we appreciate your time. Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Alina. Thanks to all of you for attending. We appreciate your time and wish you a very good day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.